It was a normal day on the road for Jasmine, a successful black woman in her 40s, driving her luxury car through the city. She had just finished an important meeting and was heading home. But as she cruised down the street, her peace was interrupted. Suddenly, the flashing lights of a police car appeared in her rearview mirror. Jasmine slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, wondering what the issue might be. The officer, a young white man, approached her car with an air of suspicion. He didn't look friendly. He leaned over to the window, looking at her with a critical eye. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, clearly looking at the car first, then at Jasmine. Jasmine gave a calm smile, knowing she hadn't done anything wrong. "No, officer, I'm not sure." The officer hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure of what to make of the situation. He looked at her again, at the car, her clothes, and then back at her. His expression grew colder, almost as if he was judging her for being in such an expensive car. "Could you please step out of the car?" he asked. A quick moment of surprise crossed Jasmine's face. Why was he being so suspicious? Was it because she was driving a luxury vehicle? Was it because she was black? "Is this really necessary?" Jasmine asked, her voice calm but firm. The officer didn't respond and instead insisted again. At this moment, Jasmine's thoughts were racing. This wasn't just an ordinary traffic stop. Something was off. The suspense in the air grew heavier, and just when it seemed like the officer might push forward with his accusations, Jasmine made the decision to reveal the truth, her identity. Little did the officer know, the woman he had just pulled over wasn't just a regular driver. She was his boss. The twist would leave him speechless. The tension in the air was thick, and the world around them seemed to freeze. Jasmine was about to teach the officer a powerful lesson that would forever change his perception. Jasmine always knew she was destined for greatness. But it wasn't something that came easily. Growing up in a small town, her family didn't have much, but they had a strong sense of community and a belief in hard work. Jasmine's parents, both hard-working individuals, always made sure she understood the value of education and perseverance. Her father worked long hours as a construction worker, often coming home tired and worn out. Despite the physical toll his job took on him, he never complained. He taught Jasmine that nothing worth having comes easy, and that the key to achieving anything in life was staying determined and focused, no matter how difficult the path seemed. Her mother, a high school teacher, was Jasmine's greatest inspiration. She spent long hours in the classroom, helping students who struggled. Her mother's commitment to education showed Jasmine that success wasn't just about money or power. It was about using knowledge to better your life and the lives of those around you. Jasmine was always a top student. She loved school and pushed herself to excel, even when others tried to discourage her. She was often the only black student in advanced classes, and there were moments when she felt like an outsider. Other kids would make snide comments, not understanding why she was so focused on her studies. But Jasmine didn't let that stop her. She wanted to prove that she was just as capable as anyone else, no matter what they thought of her. Her dream from a young age was to make a difference in the world, to rise above the limitations that society often imposed on people like her. She wanted to be a leader, someone who could shape the future and bring change. But she didn't know exactly how to achieve this dream until later in life. After high school, Jasmine earned a scholarship to a prestigious university. It was her ticket out of her small town, and she couldn't wait to start the next chapter of her life. College was a whole new world, one full of challenges, but also opportunities. It was here that Jasmine first realized how difficult it would be to climb the ladder of success as a black woman. At university, Jasmine faced not only the academic challenges of a rigorous education, but also the social and racial barriers that came with being one of the few black students in her classes. She was often faced with the assumption that she was only there because of affirmative action, and people didn't always take her seriously. She would sit in class, listening to professors and students talk about complex theories and issues, all the while feeling like her voice wasn't heard. But Jasmine wasn't going to back down. She studied harder, worked longer, and proved time and time again that she belonged. It wasn't always easy. There were days when she felt like quitting, when she doubted whether she could succeed in an environment that seemed set up for people who looked nothing like her. But Jasmine kept going, refusing to let the world's expectations define her. By the time she graduated, she had earned not only a degree in business management, but also the respect of her professors and peers. She went on to get her first job at a tech company. It wasn't the most glamorous role, but it was a start. Jasmine had learned early on that you had to earn your place before you could take charge. She worked long hours, often staying late in the office, trying to prove that she had the skills and work ethic to rise through the ranks. But in the corporate world, it wasn't just about how hard you worked. It was about who you knew and how others saw you. Jasmine knew she had to work harder than most people just to be seen as equal. As a black woman, people often doubted her abilities, and it didn't help that she was a woman in a male-dominated industry. But Jasmine took it all in stride. She became known for her sharp mind, her ability to solve problems, and her unwavering confidence in her ideas. Over the next several years, Jasmine climbed the corporate ladder. It was slow at first, but she was determined. She had faced setbacks, rejections, and moments of doubt, but each failure only made her stronger. She learned to speak up in meetings, to push her ideas forward, and to network with influential people who could help her grow. Slowly, but surely, she built her reputation. Then, one day, Jasmine received an offer that would change her life. A large tech company wanted her to come in as their chief operating officer. It was the opportunity she had been waiting for, her chance to be a leader in a company that valued diversity and innovation. This position meant more responsibility, more influence, and most importantly, a chance to create positive change in an industry that had often overlooked people like her. She took the job, and soon after, her company started thriving. Under Jasmine's leadership, the company grew in ways no one expected. She brought in new ideas, changed old systems, and focused on creating an inclusive workplace where people of all backgrounds could thrive. She used her position to make sure the company's culture was focused on respect, equality, and empowerment. She was not just a successful businesswoman. She was a trailblazer, showing other women and people of color that it was possible to break through barriers and lead at the highest levels. Despite her success, Jasmine never forgot where she came from. She made sure to give back to her community, speaking at local schools, mentoring young women of color, and offering scholarships to students who couldn't afford college. She was proud to be a role model, and she worked hard to make sure others knew that success wasn't just for people with wealth or connections. It was for anyone who was willing to work hard for it. But even with all her success, Jasmine still faced bias. She was used to people doubting her because of her appearance. She was a black woman driving a luxury car. People didn't understand how she could afford it, and many still assumed she was a token in her industry. Even though she had earned her place, some continued to treat her as if she didn't belong. It was these biases that led to the incident on the day she was stopped by a young white police officer on suspicion of being out of place. Little did the officer know, the woman he was about to question wasn't just anyone. She was about to show him how wrong he was. Jasmine had just finished a busy meeting with some important clients. The deal had gone well, and her mind was still buzzing with the excitement of the negotiations. She slid into her luxury car, a sleek black Mercedes-Benz, and started the engine. It was a warm afternoon, and the streets were calm as she began to drive back home. But as she cruised down the road, she noticed something unusual in her rearview mirror. A police car with flashing lights pulling up behind her. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't done anything wrong. There were no sharp turns or speeding. So why was the officer pulling her over? She signaled and calmly pulled over to the side of the road, as she had done many times before when driving through the city. But this time, the situation felt different. As the officer stepped out of the car, Jasmine's thoughts immediately went to the potential reason for the stop. Could it be because of the luxury car? The Mercedes had always attracted attention, especially when she was behind the wheel. As a successful black woman, she often faced judgment from others who assumed she didn't belong in such an expensive vehicle. Was this officer going to treat her like a criminal simply because of her car? The officer, a young white man, walked up to her window with his hand resting on his holster, his posture rigid. He didn't smile or greet her kindly. Instead, he leaned forward and began speaking in a firm tone. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, his voice lacking warmth. Jasmine took a deep breath. "No, officer, I don't. Is there something wrong?" The officer didn't answer her immediately. He looked her up and down, his eyes scanning the car. Jasmine could see the way he was looking at her, sizing her up, making quick assumptions based on her appearance and the car she was driving. "Could I see your driver's license and registration?" he asked, his tone more direct now, though still not entirely friendly. Jasmine reached for her glove compartment, retrieving the documents. As she handed them over, she noticed the officer's eyes narrowing, clearly still unsure of who she was or why she was driving such an expensive car. "Everything in order?" Jasmine asked, trying to keep the conversation calm, though she couldn't help but feel uncomfortable under the officer's gaze. The silence stretched between them as he looked over the papers. There was an awkward pause as the officer stepped back to his patrol car, still holding the documents. Jasmine sat in her car, waiting. She didn't know if he was running a background check or just thinking of what to say next. But the feeling of being judged was becoming unbearable. She had dealt with this kind of treatment before, people assuming she didn't belong because of her skin color and the car she drove. As she sat there, waiting for the officer to return, Jasmine wondered if he was thinking about her background, her accomplishments, or her wealth. Was he questioning whether she deserved to be in this car, to have this success? She couldn't help but feel the sting of prejudice, knowing that the officer had likely made assumptions about her that weren't based on reality. Finally, the officer returned to her window, but instead of handing back the documents, he had an entirely different question. "Do you have a permit to drive a car like this?" he asked, his voice colder now. Jasmine's eyes widened. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice shaking with disbelief. Was he questioning her right to drive her own car just because it was luxurious? The officer's eyes remained locked on her as he continued, "I've never seen someone like you behind the wheel of a car like that. You're not from around here, are you?" Jasmine felt a wave of frustration wash over her, but she stayed calm. This was no ordinary traffic stop. It was another example of how people like her were judged based on their appearance. Her car was too nice. She was too successful. And the officer assumed she didn't belong. "Officer, I don't understand what this is about," Jasmine said, trying to keep her tone even. "I haven't done anything wrong and I've shown you all the paperwork. What exactly is the problem? The officer didn't answer right away. He stepped back and turned to look at his patrol car as though he was unsure of how to handle the situation. Jasmine's frustration grew. She knew this wasn't just about a traffic violation. It was about him making assumptions based on her race, gender, and the type of car she drove. After a few moments, the officer spoke again. "I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the vehicle," he said. His tone was more forceful now. Jasmine's heart raced. The situation was escalating quickly. She hadn't expected it to go this far. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore. Something about the way the officer was acting made her feel like he wasn't just doing his job. He was targeting her. "Why?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with tension. "What's the reason for this?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, he began to open her door, his hand reaching for the handle as if he had already made up his mind. Jasmine's pulse quickened. The officer's behavior didn't make sense, and she could tell that he wasn't listening to her. This was a moment of truth. Jasmine realized that this wasn't just about a simple traffic stop. This was about how she was being seen, judged, and treated based on superficial assumptions. She could feel the injustice in the air, but she wasn't going to let it slide. She had earned everything she had worked for, and she wasn't about to let some officer's ignorance take that away. And then, as the officer began to open the door, Jasmine made a decision. It was time to stop letting people make assumptions about her. It was time to let the officer know exactly who he was dealing with. Her true identity would soon come to light. The moment the officer began to open her car door, Jasmine knew it was time to end the assumptions, once and for all. Her heart raced, not because she was afraid, but because she knew what was about to unfold was going to change everything. "Why are you doing this?" Jasmine asked, her voice steady but firm. "I told you I haven't done anything wrong." The officer paused for a moment, hand still on the door handle, and looked at her. There was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, but he didn't back down. His gaze shifted again, almost scanning her, looking at her clothes, her car, and her face, as though trying to decide what to do next. Jasmine could feel his suspicion still hanging in the air. "Ma'am," he said, still holding her door open, "this car doesn't fit you. I'm going to need you to step out." Jasmine took a deep breath. She had been calm and composed up until now, but the officer's tone was pushing her to the edge. She could feel the weight of judgment in his words, and it stung. But it wasn't the first time she'd been judged based on her appearance. In that moment, Jasmine made a decision. She wasn't just going to argue. She wasn't going to shout. Instead, she calmly spoke the words that would stop this entire situation in its tracks. "Officer, I don't think you understand," Jasmine said, keeping her voice low but firm. "You don't need to ask me to step out of the vehicle. I'm actually your boss." There was a long pause. The officer's eyes widened slightly, his body stiffened, and he stepped back from her car door. His hand dropped from the handle, and he looked at her in stunned silence. Jasmine watched as his face slowly shifted from suspicion to confusion. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The officer stood there, frozen for a moment, unsure how to respond. His eyes darted around, as though he was trying to process what she had just said. "You're my boss?" he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. Jasmine nodded. "Yes, I am the CEO of the company you work for. I'm the person who signs your paycheck." The officer blinked, still in disbelief, and looked around at the people who had gathered to watch the interaction. Some were shaking their heads. Some were looking at him with judgment. The crowd had been quiet, But the looks they were giving him said it all. They all knew something was wrong here. Jasmine could feel the eyes of the onlookers on her. Some of them were starting to understand what had just happened. They had witnessed the officer's rude behavior and were now waiting to see what would happen next. Jasmine, however, stood tall and confident, unwilling to back down. "Sir," Jasmine continued, her voice never wavering, "I've worked hard for everything I have. I've built my company from the ground up. I have earned the respect I get, and I will not be treated like this simply because I'm a woman or because of the car I drive." The officer's face turned pale. He stood there, still trying to comprehend her words. Jasmine could see the realization slowly sinking in, and it was clear he hadn't expected this. He had judged her wrongly from the very beginning, assuming she didn't belong in a luxury car because of her skin color and the way she looked. After what felt like an eternity, the officer finally spoke. "I didn't know," he stammered, clearly flustered. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" But Jasmine wasn't finished. "No, you didn't know," she said, cutting him off. "But now you do. And the next time you make an assumption about someone, especially a black woman, I hope you remember this moment." The officer was silent. He looked at her for a few seconds, his face a mix of embarrassment and regret. He seemed unsure of what to do next. The power had shifted. The authority that had been in his hands only moments before now rested in Jasmine's. She took a deep breath, knowing that the situation wasn't over yet, but this was the turning point. She had reclaimed control, not through anger, but through dignity and truth. The officer had been forced to see her as a person, not as a stereotype, and she was about to make sure this moment was remembered, not just by him, but by everyone watching. But Jasmine's lesson wasn't just for the officer. It was for everyone who still believed in judging others based on their appearance or their circumstances. It was about showing them that every person, no matter where they come from, deserves respect. And as the officer stood there, still processing what had just happened, Jasmine knew this was only the beginning. The truth had been revealed, and now it was up to everyone involved to decide what they would do with it. The officer stood frozen for a moment, his face pale and his eyes wide. Jasmine's words had completely caught him off guard, and the reality of the situation was beginning to settle in. He had just stopped the CEO of his company, someone who was not only powerful but also his superior. As Jasmine stood there, calm and composed, she watched the officer struggle to find the right words. The seconds felt like minutes. His silence was heavy with embarrassment and regret. He opened his mouth to apologize, but nothing came out at first. I didn't know," he finally muttered, his voice shaky. His hands nervously fumbled with the papers in his pocket. "I'm sorry. I really didn't mean to." Jasmine shook her head, cutting him off before he could say anything else. "It's not enough to say sorry," she said firmly. "You judged me based on the way I look and the car I drive. You didn't take a moment to see who I really am." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. The officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his expression filled with guilt. The bystanders, some of whom had been quietly observing the exchange, now began to murmur among themselves. They had been witness to something important. The officer's assumption had been proven wrong, and now they were all silently acknowledging it. "I've worked my entire life to get to where I am," Jasmine continued, her voice steady and strong. "I didn't get here by luck or by playing by the rules set for me. I got here because I worked harder than anyone else, faced obstacles that you can't even imagine, and never once let anyone tell me that I couldn't do it. You can't just judge someone by the car they drive or the clothes they wear. The officer looked down, unable to meet her eyes. He knew deep down that she was right. He had made a snap judgment based on superficial things that had nothing to do with who she was or what she had achieved. He had assumed that just because Jasmine was driving a luxury car, she didn't belong in that space. But the truth was far different, and now he was forced to face it. I know, he said, his voice softer now. I messed up. Jasmine sighed, but instead of continuing to scold him, she took a step back and softened her tone. Look, I'm not here to make you feel worse, but I want you to understand why this is so important. The next time you stop someone like me, or anyone else, don't just look at what's on the outside. Get to know the person first. Give them the respect they deserve from the start. There was a long pause, and, for the first time, the officer nodded slowly. Jasmine could see that he was starting to get it. His face was flushed with embarrassment, but there was something else in his eyes now, a sense of understanding. I'll make sure to do better, he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. I'm sorry for treating you this way. Jasmine didn't need to hear another apology. She could tell from his expression that he understood the lesson. The public watching, many of them now smiling with approval, also seemed to feel the shift in the air. It was as if everyone had witnessed a small moment of growth and change, both for the officer and for society. But the situation wasn't over yet. Jasmine could feel that there was still something else that needed to happen. She needed to make sure that this was not just a fleeting moment of realization. It needed to be a reminder that respect and understanding were crucial in every interaction. Listen, she said, her voice calm but firm. This is a teaching moment for all of us. It's not just about you learning from me. It's about us all remembering that we don't have to be defined by what others see on the surface. And that goes for you too, officer. I hope this is a wake-up call that prejudices don't belong in our society, whether it's from someone in uniform or anyone else. The officer nodded again, this time with a look of genuine gratitude. He seemed to know that this moment had changed him, not just in how he treated Jasmine, but in how he would treat everyone he met from now on. His behavior had been checked, and now he had the chance to be better. As the officer stood there, visibly humbled, Jasmine turned to the growing crowd. A few people in the group started clapping, a gesture of support for what she had just done. Jasmine's heart swelled with pride, but she remained composed, knowing that this moment wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who had witnessed it. You can go now, the officer said, his voice quieter now, his actions more respectful. He stepped back, allowing her to get back into her car. Jasmine didn't need any more words. She simply nodded, gave him a small smile, and got into her car. As she closed the door, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The world may not always understand her, but moments like these reminded her that change was possible, even in the smallest of interactions. As Jasmine sat in her luxury car, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, she took a deep breath. The moment felt surreal. The officer had backed down, apologized, and even promised to do better. She wasn't just relieved. She was proud that she had stood her ground, remained calm, and taught a valuable lesson. But she knew this wasn't the end of it. Her encounter with the officer wasn't just about this one interaction. It was a chance to make an impact, to change the way people thought about others. It was about showing that prejudices didn't belong in today's world. And Jasmine knew that the ripple effect of what had just happened would go far beyond this street. The crowd around her had started to disperse, but some people were still watching. Jasmine saw a few people nodding in approval, exchanging looks with one another. It wasn't just the officer who had learned something today. The people who had witnessed the situation had also been a part of that moment. They had seen the power of standing up for yourself, and they had seen how important it was to treat others with respect. The officer, now standing a few feet away, looked uncertain. His head hung low as if he were reflecting on his actions. He had been confronted with his own biases and was now processing it all. Jasmine knew that, for him, this moment would stick with him. Maybe he didn't fully understand what it was like to face discrimination every day, but at least now he knew the importance of checking his assumptions and treating everyone equally, no matter their appearance. As Jasmine started the car and began driving away, her thoughts were still on what had just happened. She hadn't been angry or combative with the officer. She had simply shown him the truth that people should be judged for their character, not their clothes, car, or skin color. It had been a lesson in humility for him, and in courage for her. Later that day, Jasmine received a call from her assistant. News about the traffic stop had already spread, and it had caught the attention of many. While Jasmine had handled it calmly, others had seen it as a moment of empowerment. Her phone was buzzing with messages of support from her colleagues and even strangers who had heard about the incident. They admired her for handling it with grace, but most of all, for using her position to challenge the unfair treatment she had faced. But not everyone was happy about what had happened. The officer's colleagues had already heard the news, and there were mixed reactions. Some felt embarrassed by his actions, while others tried to defend him, claiming he had just been doing his job. Jasmine knew this was only the beginning. She could feel that her encounter with the officer would lead to bigger discussions about how authority figures should treat people. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for the principle of fairness and equality for everyone. The officer's supervisors contacted her later that afternoon to express their regret for what had happened and to assure her that the situation would be handled appropriately. Jasmine appreciated the call, but she knew the real change would come from within the officer himself. It would be his responsibility to learn from this experience and to reflect on the way he treated people in the future. Jasmine's day ended on a reflective note. As she walked into her office, she felt a sense of peace. She had stood up for herself, but she had also stood up for something much larger. She had stood up for respect for the idea that people should be seen for who they are, not for what they look like or the stereotypes others place on them. The next day, a story about the incident went viral. News outlets covered the event, and social media buzzed with opinions. Some people criticized the officer for his behavior, while others praised Jasmine for how she handled the situation. The public conversation quickly shifted from focusing on the officer's actions to a broader discussion about race, prejudice, and authority. Jasmine used the platform she had built to speak up on the issue. She gave an interview where she shared her story and explained why the moment had been so important. "I'm not here to make people feel guilty," Jasmine said during the interview, "but I am here to challenge the way we see each other. We all have biases, but it's our responsibility to recognize them and change how we treat one another. This isn't about the officer, it's about all of us. We need to do better." Her words resonated with many people. Messages of support flooded in from all over the world, with people sharing their own experiences and expressing hope that this conversation would lead to real change. The officer, too, faced consequences for his actions. His behavior was reviewed by his superiors, and he was required to attend bias training to better understand the importance of treating everyone with respect. Jasmine didn't want to see him punished, but she did want to make sure that he learned from this experience. Accountability was important, and she hoped this would lead to a positive change in his actions going forward. As the weeks passed, Jasmine continued to use her position to promote conversations about fairness and equality. She worked with other leaders in her industry to create programs that would address bias and promote inclusivity within their companies. She knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but she also knew that moments like the one she experienced would help pave the way for a better future. Jasmine took a deep breath as she sat in her car, reflecting on the surprising turn of events. The officer, now visibly humbled, had apologized and promised to do better. She knew this moment wasn't just about him. It was about making a bigger statement on how people should be treated fairly, no matter their appearance. As she drove away, she realized this wasn't the end. Her experience had started a conversation, not just for the officer, but for everyone who witnessed the incident. People in the crowd had started to reflect on their own biases, while the officer had begun to question his own actions. Jasmine had used her voice to teach him, and the rest of the world, a powerful lesson. The news quickly spread. Support flooded in from people who admired how Jasmine had handled the situation with grace. She had faced judgment before, but now she was using her platform to address it. In interviews, Jasmine emphasized that this wasn't just about one officer. It was about challenging biases and demanding respect for everyone. The officer was put under review and required to undergo bias training. Jasmine didn't want to punish him, but she wanted him to learn from this moment and treat people equally moving forward. This wasn't just a personal victory for Jasmine. It was a victory for everyone who has ever been judged by their appearance. Her story sparked a conversation about prejudice and equality, and she continued to use her position to push for change in the corporate world. Jasmine knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight, but every step, every conversation, was a step closer to a fairer society. As Jasmine drove away from the incident, she couldn't help but think about the bigger picture. Her experience wasn't just about standing up for herself. It was a chance to remind us all of the importance of respect and fairness. Now, she wants to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where you were judged based on how you look or what you drive? How did you handle it? Jasmine's story isn't just her own. It's one that many of us can relate to. Comment below with your thoughts, whether you agree, disagree, or have your own story to share. Let's keep this conversation going and make sure we're all treating each other with the respect we deserve. If you found this story meaningful, like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on future stories that challenge the norms and encourage change. Thanks for being part of this journey with us.